Okay, so I'm here with Jack Wakely, pronouns they, them. They're involved with the Londoners Renters Union, Health Watch Lewisham, among other organisations. So could you introduce yourself a bit more to the podcast audience?
I am a theatre maker in my sort of day job and producer. I have been involved with London Renters Union for a little while as a member solidarity lead. I'm also involved with ACT Up London and their general hijinks. And also, yeah, previously was working with Health Watch Lewisham in the capacity of being a steering group member when they were doing a study around access to trans healthcare in Lewisham, but also healthcare in general and the issues that trans people in Lewisham face, accessing it on all levels. And I came to them with a complaint that I had to make about a healthcare worker in Lewisham who treated me very poorly. So that's how I got involved with them and wanted to kind of continue working with them where I could support them in getting this information so that they could then hopefully push it out to health watchers across the country and be able to make some concrete changes to the way that healthcare works for trans folks.
So can you tell us a bit more about your kind of, I suppose, coming out journey and what happened for you growing up?
The entire time I was at school was under Section 28, literally from the day I started until the day I end. Like they finally abolished it the summer that I left my A levels. So it was there for the entirety of that. And I think that had a really huge effect on my ability to kind of recognize my own queerness, let alone be able to voice it, let alone feel like there was a safe place where I could speak about it. So I didn't actually sort of come out until I left secondary school and I came out to somebody who I used to walk home from school with every day because I was like, this is the last time I might ever see her. So I'm just going to come out to her and then run away. So that was when I was 16 and that was when I was coming out as queer, as bisexual. And then as I got older, I think, as is the case with a lot of trans folks, not everybody, but there were tells throughout my life that I was not the gender I was assigned at birth. Whether that was a period of my childhood where I went by a totally different name and insisted on being referred to as Simon, or my teenage years spent very like voraciously reading any information I could find about transness, but convincing myself it was me being an incredibly great ally. Actually, I'm really interested. And so, yeah, I used to spend a lot of time reading forums and, people's stories and just being like, yeah, this is just very, very interesting to me. There's definitely nothing more to it than that, which was obviously a lot of self denial. I finally came out when I was 30, which obviously pretty late in the game. I think I'd already started to come out to myself first. You always do come out to yourself before anybody else. And then started to come out to more and more people until finally I kind of hit a point where I just was like, I want everybody to know who I am. So I did the very brave millennial thing of making a Facebook post to tell people and then turning my phone off and not coming back to it for like 6 hours. And then thankfully, I came back to a lot of really supportive messages. And this was before Facebook was like a hellscape where it was just conspiracy theories and nastiness. This was back when, people just talked on there and people just enjoyed it. Prior to that, I'd obviously come out to the people closest to me, had those conversations with people, and thankfully was really faced with like overwhelming positivity, and also a lot of people being like, yeah, we figured, which I think is not unheard of for a lot of trans folks. Yeah, so it's at that point that then I was like, I want to sort of look at what my options are in terms of medical transition. It was always quite important to me. I know that's not the same for every trans person. And that was kind of where I started to hit roadblocks. Like from the very beginning, I think a lot of people, when they think of trans healthcare, they think about the astronomical waiting lists, which are absolutely an enormous problem. It's unbelievable that we're expecting trans folks to wait that long just to even get like a first appointment. Even getting that first appointment is a challenge. It took me 3 doctors to finally get someone who sent me to the GIC. The first one told me we don't do that on the NHS. The second one told me he'd send me somewhere and then sent me to a closed psychiatric unit to be met with a psychiatrist who told me that she had no idea why I was there. Finally, the third doctor I went to actually, put me on the list to be seen at the GIC. But I also think that it could have been very, very easy for any of those previous times for me to have gone, okay, and just given up. And I'm very aware and was from that moment sort of very aware that there are people who aren't as able to advocate for themselves, aren't as used to advocate for themselves as I have been. and who would fall at those first stumbling blocks, and how angry that makes me to think that you meet a doctor who just tells you no, and then the amount of people who may have just fell by the wayside that way was like part of what really made me become quite passionate about access to gender affirming care, and sort of expanding the conversation about that beyond just it takes ages to get to the GIC, but to actually talk about all of the things that stand in your way before that, and all the things that continue to stand in your way, just like interacting with the medical world as a trans person, regardless of if it's actually related to your gender affirming care or your transition.
So is this kind of related to what this is related to why you got involved with Lewisham Healthwatch, right?
So I got involved with Healthwatch because I needed to make a complaint about a healthcare worker who treated me really, really badly. And that was for me, like, it wasn't like, oh, this is the first doctor I've ever met who's treated me like shit. It was, this is the point where it's become so egregious that I don't think I can just leave it. And so at that point, I knew that I wanted to pursue just some recourse. I just wanted like to be heard about what had happened there, about my experience there, and also to ensure that that couldn't happen to other people, because it was so egregious that that I was like, this person feels like an active danger to people. And so I reached out to Healthwatch, who were there to act as like advocates, who essentially helped me stay on top of the complaints process. Because I think with these things, you have to be so on top of it. If you're not someone who is hyper organized, if you're not somebody who has huge amounts of mental space and stability to be able to like go through this process, having an advocacy service like Healthwatch is really, really helpful in terms of they're just there to be like, oh, we've not had a response from this person, we're going to email them. It's their job to kind of be on top of that. And that helped me massively through that process, which I'm glad to say was actually really successful, and we got like a very good outcome from it. I chatted to the people I was with there who were talking about doing this study, this sort of further research project around it, and asked me if I'd like to be involved. And I thought, yeah, that's very up my alley. If it's something that I can do that will help make this study happen, and then hopefully get this information out there so that more medical practitioners and more trusts and stuff like that are aware of what's going on and aware of what like the trans community actually needs. So there was a steering group of us, but then there were also interviewees. So it was a very broad like group of people. I'm very aware that one trans person's experience is just one trans person's experience. And there's so many other elements of like intersectionality, disability, class, race, that it wasn't going to be, we talked to one person and that's it. We've got the entire experience of trans folks in Lewisham. So, that they tried to reach out to as sort of broad a pool of people as possible.
How would you kind of say intersectionality kind of impacts the experience of going through a transition?
I mean, I think intersectionality impacts so much. I'm very aware that as a disabled person, the way that my relationship with my body is seen is slightly skewed by the medical world. I'm aware that as a neurodivergent person, that also skews it. I've heard numerous people talking about how someone who's autistic can't possibly know if they're trans or not, which is the biggest crock of shit I've ever heard. But like, so that's a huge intersection. Race becomes a huge intersection. We know that black and brown people have worse outcomes in most medical settings because of institutionalized systemic racism. So, if you're a black trans woman and you're trying to transition, you're trying to access this, you're going to hit barriers that I, as a white trans masc person, am not ever going to hit. And similarly, different barriers you hit if you're transmasc or transfemme. There's different barriers you hit depending on your education level, your class, all of these things. With the assumption that if somebody isn't eloquent, that means that like the medical world can think them stupid and therefore go, well, can you actually tell me who you say you are? Are you actually cogent enough? Which again is such nonsense and makes me furious. But yeah, all of these things interact so massively. And also the worse experiences you have with healthcare, the less likely you are to even want to go out and seek it. So we definitely like heard from a lot of trans folks, especially trans people of colour, that they'd had such bad experiences in healthcare even before they'd come out as trans, that it had really burnt them and they didn't really want to access healthcare of any kind now, when even like whether that was related to their transition or whether it was related to just their general health. So I think it's really important that whenever these conversations happen, that is included as a factor, because that does colour everything about it, is all of the things that like a doctor sees when they look at you, and the assumptions they make based on that.
How has kind of having the medical procedures, how has that sort of changed? Like, how have you felt afterwards, if that makes sense?
I mean, for me, transitioning was life-saving. Like ultimately, like before I was able to access gender affirming care, I spent most of my adult life feeling like I didn't exist below my neck. Like I very much just sort of like saw my body as transport for my brain and tried to disconnect from it, didn't like to think about it. And that is also informed by the fact that, I'm also disabled and have like a chronic pain condition. So those two elements just made me kind of want to shut things off from the neck down. But being able to access gender affirming care, whether that is hormones, whether that is like voice training, whether that is surgeries, is has been really, really just like the best thing I ever did. I think like one of the last times I went to the GIC, because I have to go back regularly, they monitor your hormone levels, they're keeping sort of track of things, asking you what it is that you're wanting to do next. They asked me like, how do you feel about the fact that you took hormones? And they do this like every time, you go through the same questions every time. But I remember getting the report back and I'd said like best thing I ever did. And then like the time before that, it was like literally wish I'd done it sooner. So, you kind of actually, I've got this sort of stack of reports from my time of being like moving through the GIC that very much spell out how important it's been for me. So if I ever seem to forget, I've got those to kind of refer to and go, yeah, no, this has really been like life changing. And I think that this is not to say that every trans person wants to access gender affirming care in the medical setting. But for me, it was very important and always was. I think it's really important that people know what options are available to them and that also it's not all or nothing. I know some trans folks who've taken hormones and that's all they've wanted to do. I know some trans folks who've had various surgeries but not taken hormones. I know people who've had top surgery and that was it, and that was enough for them to be in a place where they're comfortable with their body and where they're comfortable in themselves. But I think that having just the option to be able to choose and to be able to access these things in a timely fashion is like a human right as far as I'm concerned. Like I think that we know that transitioning, whether that is medical, whether that is social, whether that is so many things, saves lives. We know that. Like there are numerous studies that show that. So I think that, that is it's like I said, it's a human right to be able to access these things and to be able to access them and not wait decades to get anywhere with it. The vast majority of people I see who are accessing gender affirming care are crowdfunding. They are relying on the kindness of their communities, which thankfully there is a huge amount of community care and community kindness and solidarity. But the fact is, I wouldn't have been able to access the care in the time that I did if I'd not had money. Basically, my grandmother died, left me a small chunk of money, and that was what allowed me to transition on my terms and in my timeline. If I hadn't had that, I would still be very, very early doors in it. And I, like I said, came out like 9 years ago. So the fact that I can easily look at where I'd actually be now if I'd had to go through the process and not been able to jump the queue because of just the privilege of having some money in my pocket. Yeah, it's really quite excruciating to kind of imagine, to sort of put the me that I am now with that privilege against the me that it could have been if my grandmother hadn't died, if my grandmother hadn't squirreled away cash throughout her entire like adult life just to save to give to her family when she died. Because we're not talking huge amounts of money, but we're talking huge amounts of money for a woman from like a working class background to sit on for years waiting until she could give it to her family. Admittedly, she'd be baffled with what I spent it on, but I like to think that thing that she said in her will when she handed that money to myself, my sibling, my like cousins, all of that was use this to make you happy, which is a beautiful thing to do. And I'm very appreciative of that for her. And I very much did that, even if she wouldn't understand the thing I did to make myself happy. But yeah, I think that I'm very aware of like there's that shadow self who didn't have that, and how it's really heartbreaking to see how many people don't have access to that. We shouldn't have to wait for someone we love to die to be able to become ourselves, to be able to like self-actualize. We shouldn't have to rely on each other, but ultimately we do. We're all we have. So I think that the queer community has always been like at the forefront of community care and solidarity, so of course we're doing it again now.
And do you think there's enough kind of support out there in terms of deciding which kind of procedure is right for each person? So, for example, whether they need to do the hormones or whether they need to do surgery, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think you have to go to very specialist places to get that support. Unfortunately, like the average GP can't answer those questions or doesn't even know where to start. The average GP probably looks like a deer in headlights if you mention transitioning, from my experience. Their GP surgeries in London, I think they're countrywide, but they're definitely in London. There are Pride in Practice GP surgeries that receive training in how to like treat LGBTQ plus folks like human beings and patients. So those places are amazing. I'm lucky enough to live close enough to one of those to have that as my practice. So they're amazing. If you can look those up, you can sort of Google Pride in Practice and find those. And I know that in the past, like when I've moved from an area and away from a doctor's surgery, I've been able to kind of stay on the books there if I, sign a thing saying I accept that I can't get house calls now I'm outside of the catchment area. So there are options there. In London, there's the amazing Clinic Q. I went to them and they were able at the time, and again, this was years ago, were able to provide me with access to some free therapy sessions where I could have those conversations with a therapist who wasn't involved in the GIC, wasn't involved in that process. And it meant I could have a place to really just brain dump without worrying about how it would colour my chances of accessing X, Y, and Z. That therapist is someone who was finishing their training, and so they were getting their hours up through volunteering there. That person is now my therapist. So we've stayed in touch. Once she got her training, she is now my regular therapist. So that was invaluable. So yeah, Clinic Q, who are now based in Denmark Hill. There's 56T at 56 Dean Street, who are obviously a wonderful sexual health clinic, and that is a weekly clinic that they run that is specifically for trans and gender non-conforming and gender diverse folks. That has been amazing. There are great sources of information online. There are a lot of amazing charities who are out there putting out work that's really important. But it is the case that unfortunately a lot of it is coming from within the community. Like Clinic Q was set up by a trans person for trans people. So yeah, and I do believe that that's right. To be honest, I do think that that as a community we know our needs better than a cis person ever could. Like I think that cis people can learn a lot. Of course they can, and they should if they're working in medicine and everything around kind of healthcare, whether that is working on the front desk, whether that is being a porter, whether that is like any element of that. But I do think that what we need is best led by us, which is why we need to kind of give resources to organizations like Clinic Q to help them grow. Like what they do is incredible. What they do is absolutely amazing. It sucks that it's like once a week that you can access it. And there are so many of us who need it and like only so many slots available. And also outside of London, there are places like Clinic Q, there are other organizations, but again, they're so few and far between and they're so over subscribed and underfunded that it's like really tricky. But so the info is there. Unfortunately, you'd have to search for it. It's not gonna. At the moment, it just doesn't get served to us. That's only getting worse, I think, as like trans lives are being politicized and it's becoming this political football where, God forbid, you let a trans person access information about their own body and like their own lives. So yeah, it is out there, but there's not nearly enough of it, and it's not nearly well funded enough. Don't want that to dishearten people.
I do have a question kind of about the politicization. There's some people who seem to kind of think that you go to your healthcare provider and you kind of almost get put on the list for surgery straight away. It must be like a fairly long process to sort of go for the options because they need to kind of talk things through to you and kind of see the reason for your transition, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's so gatekept at the moment. This image people have of like a 16-year-old rocking up to the doctor and going, I think I might be trans, and then being immediately operated upon or given hormones or given, puberty blockers is just not true. That's just not how it works. Like for my own experience, like I said, it took me 3 doctors to get one who actually put me on that pathway. Then I waited, and again, this was years ago, so my wait was short by comparison to now. I waited a couple of years to be seen at the GIC for my first appointment. I was told that I wouldn't be able to access anything until I'd had at least 2 appointments. And when I was given my second appointment, it was over a year later. So then that was like, even before we'd even be able to discuss hormones, be able to discuss getting put on a waiting list for surgery, that was what was sitting in the way there. In order to access surgery, even though I, like I said, was lucky enough to have the money to go private for it, I had to be seen by 2 psychiatrists to confirm that yes, I was trans. So I had to meet with two people to sign off and say yes, this person is who they say they are. And then I was able to access surgery. But again, it wasn't like I just walked into a surgeon's office and then they just operated on me that afternoon. I met with the surgeon. We had a conversation about outcomes. It's a slow process. And like I said, that was years ago and accessing some private care, and it was still slow. To give you some idea, I fairly recently had surgery that was through the NHS, that was through the GIC process. And like I said, that's like 9 years after the journey started that I accessed that surgery. So we're not talking about things happening overnight. Also, just because I have to add it, when it comes to puberty blockers and the current ridiculous, dangerous legislation that the government are trying to put in place to ban them for trans kids, if they're so dangerous, why are they happy to give them to cis children? Because most people who take puberty blockers are cis children who have precocious puberty. They start to go through puberty very young. They get put on puberty blockers to delay that. And then they come off them at a stage where continuing the puberty is going to be less distressing, more comfortable, more safe. It's exactly the same thing for trans kids, that, you know, puberty blockers just buy them time to think. It buys them time to go through that process without having to go through puberty, which is deeply distressing if you are not the gender that you're assumed to be. Going through a quote unquote male puberty, and I say quote unquote because I don't think there's such a thing as like an inherently male puberty, but what we consider that is deeply distressing if you're a woman. And similarly, going through a quote unquote female puberty is deeply distressing if you're not a woman, if you're a man, or if you're transmasc. So, you know, it's a slow, arduous process with gatekeepers all the way. They're not just handing these things out like Skittles. They're really, really not. And it's so absurd to suggest that they are. It fundamentally, to me, tells me those people just haven't done any reading about it, because they're not interested in actually the reality of what it is. They're not interested in the reality of what it is to be a trans person trying to access that. They're interested in the sensationalist headlines. And then it's also the people who then buy into those sensationalist headlines and don't look deeper, don't speak to trans folks, don't know that what's actually happening is very, very different to what the Daily Mail is suggesting, where like a 15-year-old walks into a doctor's surgery and leaves with hormones and a like surgery in a week's time. It's just not even close to true. It's just pure fiction.
So the waiting lists have increased. So how's this impacted people basically?
I mean, to be completely frank, people are dying. People are dying because of this. Because it's not easy to live in this world, especially in this country, especially in this kind of time right now where there is so much sensationalism and so much cruelty and so much nastiness. It's not an easy like world to navigate as a trans person. And yeah, I can't put it any more clear than that. People are taking their lives. People are dying by suicide because they can't bear this weight. Like, and it's not the occasional person. Everybody knows somebody or knows somebody who knows somebody within the community who has found themselves in that situation, who has lost their lives because of this. And so it's really that serious. We are talking life and death. And we're also beyond that talking like the difference between just surviving and getting to thrive. We're talking about just people being denied the basic joy of being able to be themselves. It's so huge the impact this is having that I can't even overstate it. Like people will say, oh, they're being dramatic by saying that, you know, this is life and death, but genuinely the statistics are there. And these are statistics that transphobic trolls love to throw at trans folks about like how many people die by suicide in the trans community. That's not because they're trans. It's because of the world that we're living in. It's because of people trolling like that. It's because of like a lack of access to healthcare. It's about, you know, it's because of a lack of access to gender affirming care. It's about a lack of acceptance. So, you know, it's not just like spontaneously by being trans, we're more at risk of those things. It's because we live in a world that treats us like shit for being trans. And because people aren't able to access these things that would be able to affirm them, that would be able to also, in a lot of cases, make them safer. Because ultimately, you know, for some people, and this isn't the goal for every trans person, but for some people, the goal is passing as cis. Because it's safer too. If you're assumed to be a cis person, you're less likely to face violence, especially as a trans woman, especially as a trans woman of color, and especially if you're a trans woman of color who is a sex worker or who is working class, you're more at risk because of all the risk factors that come into play there, plus your transness. So yeah, being able to access gender affirming care, it's not just about being able to be comfortable and happy and content and like live in your own body. It's also about safety, because it's dangerous to move through the world as a visibly trans person. Like, I don't know a single trans person that's not dealt with violence or threat or any of that. Like, just by going through life, like being on the street, living your life, just trying to go to the fucking shops, just trying to like get a tube, Like it's not safe because the world's been made unsafe for us. So for a lot of people, access to gender affirming care is also the difference between feeling constantly afraid and being able to move through the world with a bit of ease and a bit of freedom. So yeah, it's genuinely, I can't overstate what a huge impact these waiting lists, these gatekeepers, this narrative around, trying to make it as difficult as possible for people to access these things. It's genuinely, the impact is colossal and devastating.
What kind of advice would you give to someone who thinks they're trans and is questioning, basically?
Yeah, I think if you're questioning, there's spaces online that you can find, there's resources you can find, whether that is through community run like chat rooms, forums, things like that. But also, there are, as I said, great charities doing amazing work. If you're in London, I can't overstate how incredible Clinic U and 5016 Street are in terms of a place to just sort of like a soft place to land and be able to access some support, and also just to be able to be in a space where you're surrounded by other trans folks. There are amazing like club nights and like community organizations, the incredible Open Barbers, who I can't speak more highly of. Like, they're incredible. They are a hair salon, but that offers like, their entire remit is, we don't assume anyone's gender or sexuality. And if you just want to go there and just like be in the space and not even get a haircut, you can. If you want to just like be in a space where you can feel safe and feel affirmed and feel surrounded by people who are like you, that's great. I think that, don't be afraid to seek out this information. Don't be afraid to reach out to like people who love you, and know that it's not always the case that someone you love will have the most amazing response. Unfortunately, we don't live in a world where we can guarantee that. But I hope that most people have someone that they can at least have these conversations with. We know for a fact that the vast majority of people aren't anti-trans folks. We know that the statistics show that it's a vocal minority and also a very powerful minority that are suggesting that this is a world that completely loathes trans people. There are so many people out there who love you and support you and want to like be there for you and want to see the future with you in it. So, I think it's just really important to like find those spaces and find those people. I think in the same way that neurodivergent folks tend to sort of find other neurodivergent folks just in their like social lives, I think that queer and trans folks also tend to sort of hover together even before necessarily we realize who we are. It's just kind of like we almost sort of see each other in the dark, and then after we get together, I wish I could say that for any young trans folks that they could go to someone in their school and receive like support from them. Unfortunately, with the way that the government is pushing things, and with the way things are being pushed, that isn't a guarantee, and that's so shit, because that's exactly the experience that so many of us had with Section 28, and not having anyone that you could kind of just even just mention these things to at school. But there are people, I know teachers, I know wonderful people in education who are doing the work to try and make those safer places for trans and gender non-conforming kids as well. So I guess like the big thing is, please hang on in there and know that there is like a world, a community, there is a world of people who want to see you like blossom. And if you're not trans, if you're questioning and you go thoughtful and at the end of it you go, yeah, actually, I don't think I am, that's also wonderful, fabulous. How amazing to have been able to kind of explore yourself. We're all entitled to explore ourselves. And as I said, it's not like people are going and very swiftly getting like gender affirming surgeries. So it's a safe place to like play with. Why shouldn't a teenager be able to be like, oh, I don't know, actually, am I a boy? Am I a girl? Do I like these pronouns? Does this feel right? Like just to be able to explore and play. God knows, I mean, I look at the way I was when I was a teenager. I tried on like different aesthetics. I tried on different interests. I tried on like, considered my sexuality and all of these things. Like, we're entitled to that. We're entitled to experiment. We're entitled to ask questions about ourselves. So I think, yeah, that's my big thing, is just like know that there are places and people who are out there. You can find them. I promise.
So the previous government, in terms of its attitude towards trans people,
Yeah.
or towards, I suppose, people who are not cisgendered,
Yeah. Just anyone who's not cis gender.
anyone
Yeah.
who's not cis, is kind of, it wasn't great. So how does the current government's stance differ from the previous one? What kind of needs to be tackled in terms of how they view non-cis people?
So just for anyone who's got this one, just to clarify, so cis is the opposite of trans. So if you're not trans, you're cis. If you're not cis, you're trans. Like, they are just two descriptors. So I know that there's been this huge movement of cis is a slur. It's not. No more than calling someone blonde is a slur. It's just a description, and all it does is exist in opposition to the idea of transness. So it's not a slur. It's not a bad thing to be. None of that. I think that, so obviously, like the last government were very openly transphobic, used it as a football to try and score points. It was the Tory government who brought in the emergency ban on puberty blockers, which they snuck through just before they closed Parliament to make sure that it couldn't be like undone, basically. But it is now this Labour government who are talking about making that ban permanent. It is now a cis gay politician who is the person who is doing that, which feels just like an extra sort of kick in the teeth, that it's someone from within the LGBTQ plus community who has himself talked about how difficult it was for him to come out, how difficult it was for him to not feel actualized and not feel like he was able to be himself, to then turn around and sort of like kick us is just the audacity. It's just extra infuriating. But this government, this Labour government, they ran their sort of like election drive around shitting on trans people too. For some reason, political people think that the most important issue of the day, above so many other things, is trans folks. And it's so wild to me that we're such a small group of people, but we seem to take up such huge real estate in these people's brains and in their plans. So yeah, this government will show up at the Pride Parade, but they'll still like shit on you, ultimately. I have been someone who voted for Labour in the past. I did not vote for Labour this time around. I couldn't bring myself to, for numerous reasons, but one of them being the way that they have played into this narrative of transness as a dangerous thing, of playing the game of, well, of course, I wouldn't allow a trans woman to be on a women's ward. It's such punching down. There's just no other word for it, because like ultimately we're already a community that hugely marginalized, and then they're scoring points by just sort of seeing how much further down they can push us. It's vile. So yeah, unfortunately it feels like much the same thing, but now they're just wearing a slightly different suit. So it's just like business as usual. It doesn't feel like a huge difference. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are some people who are very happy with the way things are going under the current government. I am not. But it's wonderful to see that there are people kind of like taking the fight to them. Another thing I would very much recommend for any sort of young people who are questioning and kind of curious, there's an amazing organization that is run by trans youth called Trans Kids Deserve Better. And they are just the most badass kids and young people. They're so cool. They went and occupied the Department of Education. They slept out in these like little arches outside the Department of Education to protest the way that their lives are being used to score points, the way that they're being treated in education settings, in a place that, is supposed to be about nourishing kids and looking after them. And they are doing amazing work and genuinely like real grassroots, led by the people. It's incredible stuff. So yeah, they're on social media, on Instagram and such, as Trans Kids Deserve Better. And they are just so fucking cool. I love those kids so much. They shouldn't have to be doing this. There's no reason why these kids should be having to protest on the streets, but they know that they need to, and they're doing it, and they're amazing. I think that, we've still got a very, very long way to go, and we're still currently dealing with another political party that won't just acknowledge the basic fact that trans women are women and trans men are men and non-binary people exist in the world. It's having real impacts already.
I suppose it's also the thing that people talk about trans women being in women's spaces, but actually trans women are more at risk of violence. They're less likely to perpetrate violence.
Yeah, I think it comes down to sort of two things. One is it's people just refusing to see trans women as women. They're seeing them as men and seeing men as dangerous. I understand a fear of like men. I understand that we've seen like we're living through an epidemic of violence towards women and girls, and it's men perpetrating this violence. It's men killing and injuring and just generally menacing women. It's not trans women doing that, and nobody is going through the process of transitioning just so that they can get into your toilet. Like if a cis man wants to go into a woman's toilet, he'll walk in. It's not like he's going to go, oh, I better go and go through 5 years of waiting list. 5 years would be lucky at this point to go through that. That's just not the case. That's just not how it works. So it is coming from this fundamental refusal to see trans women as women, but it is also this narrative that is going around that trans folks are somehow out to get you. Like when I go to the toilet, all I want to do is just go to the toilet. That's all I'm there to do. I don't want to have a conversation with anyone. I'm not like, please just let me piss. Just please. And I've had people, even as a trans mass person, I've had people try and stop me entering toilets. Like I've had men try to stop me entering men's toilets. I've had people question why I'm in there. And like, that is the tip of the iceberg. I'm lucky it's just been questioning. People face violence because of this. And also, ultimately, what happens is we end up in the situation we've seen recently of people assuming a cis woman is trans based on how she looks. Which then it's like, what's the plan here? Is J.K. Rowling planning to like sit outside of every public toilet and sequence people's genes so that she can check what their chromosomes are so she can decide where they're allowed to piss? Like, come on, it's ridiculous. And like you say, trans women are more at risk of violence than they are at risk of perpetrating it, like so much more. It's just one of those things that's so fundamentally bizarre to me that people refuse to see it. And I do think that, yes, the vast majority of people are just very poorly informed, have been misinformed, deliberately disinformed, actually, by people who have something to gain from this. But it's the people on top who are spreading this disinformation. And I do say disinformation, not misinformation, because disinformation is done with purpose. Misinformation is I didn't know any better. Disinformation is I know better and I'm going to spread this anyway. And that's what we're really dealing with is bad actors who are literally pushing just falsehoods because they feel they've got something to gain from it, which we've shown that they do. They gain things like political power from doing so. The other thing I sort of say to people when they're like, I don't want trans women in women's toilet, the trans folks should have to use the toilet of their birth sex, which let's not even get into the ludicrousness of that language. But I know some trans folk, some trans men who pass as cis men. You want them in women's toilets? Because that's a man in a woman's toilet at that point. That's a man in a woman's toilet, and that's what you say you don't want. Yeah, so it's just one of those things. It's like, have you thought any of this through at all, or are you just kind of parroting what you've heard, what you've read on Twitter? Is it just kind of reiterating these same just nonsense arguments that really don't mean much? And the fact that when we've kind of in the past gone, okay, well, what if we have gender neutral toilets where then we don't have to worry about that? And then you've got a government going, we want to get rid of gender neutral toilets, actually. And it's just like, fuck. Anytime you sort of even offer, like, we offer like even like a little bit of give to be like, okay, what about this? They're like, no. I think actually we'd like the option that actually puts you more at risk of danger and violence, actually. I think we'll go with that one, which is wild. I mean, I don't know about you. I've got a gender neutral toilet in my house and we don't seem to have a problem with those, do we? We're happy to share those with people. And I go, oh, but you live with those people. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. It's such a wild, quite debate. And again, like, we're talking about people's lives. It ain't a debate.
Do you have anything else to say on kind of like trans issues or gender queerness?
Yeah, for me, I think one of the things that for me was really empowering and felt really gratifying and really affirming was to look at history and look at the people who came before me and who fought for my like rights to be here. So whether that is like, you know, the trans women of colour who started Pride, who started the riot at Stonewall, who stood up for themselves and who are the reason like why queer people have the rights they have. So like, you know, every time a like gay person shits on trans people, I'm like, so you're a traitor because these are the people who won you your rights and now you're turning around and you're shitting on us. So I like, you know, looking to history and finding that, but looking even beyond that, the fact is trans people have always existed. Like you can go back to ancient Mesopotamia and find references to people who are not male or female. You can look at Native American cultures and find people who aren't male or female or people who transition. You can look at cultures all around the world where trans folks existed and thrived and were often revered as healers and visionaries and all of these things. I did a huge amount of research into the history of transness for a show that I did called God Who Is a Woman. That was myself and two of my wonderful colleagues, JC and Cordelia, a show about the fact that the Beckett estate won't let anybody but cis men perform the show Waiting for Godot, a show that's supposed to be about humanity, it's supposed to be about being a person, and which is a ludicrous thing in and of itself. But so I spent a lot of time researching the history of transness, and it is a rich and beautiful and magical history of incredible people, and also people who were just living their lives, who weren't doing anything radical, were just existing, and that in itself is radical. Like, I don't believe every trans person should have to be an activist. I don't believe we should all have to stand at the front of protests. We shouldn't all have to throw the first brick. We should also just be able to live, and to be able to look back and see people who did and just lived their life and did everyday things and did amazing things, because we're just people in the end. We do great things and we do boring things and all of that. That for me was really affirming, and I think is a really important thing. And finding community, finding people like you. As I said, we're so blessed in a lot of ways. The internet has been a tool for so much bad, but it's also been an incredible tool for connection. And I really, that is how people meet their people now. And that's how I met my people as a teenager, by being on chat rooms and like, because I wasn't finding them at home. So yeah, for me, I think you will find your people, you'll find your like gang, and that is really important and affirming and beautiful. Yeah, just look to history and just stick around. Like I promise, like there are so many people fighting for this world to be better, and I do firmly believe it will be. I think this is the like death throes of a dying movement. This anti-trans nonsense. I don't believe that this is the future. I believe that we're better than this. And maybe that's naive of me, but I believe that as humans we're better than this, and I believe that that Overton window will be pushed again, and that we will see a place, hopefully within my lifetime. I really hope so, within my lifetime. I'm choosing to believe it will be then. I'm not that old. That we'll see a world where people just let us get the fuck on with our lives and let us like live the lives that we want to live, and just see us as people rather than pawns or political footballs or debates.
If you like this episode, you can follow and rate. You might also like to check out the Instagram with the same name to learn more about our guests and just keep up with the podcast in general.